Gilead survives by controlling choices. That is the real foundation of the entire regime. Not the laws, not the violence, not even the fear, control. The moment people lose the ability to choose for themselves, Gilead wins. Which is exactly why Agnes may be far more dangerous than she realizes. Because hidden underneath everything happening in the Testaments is one terrifying possibility. Agnes, making the right choice at the right moment, could begin a chain reaction powerful enough to crack Gilead from the inside. Not through war, not through rebellion, through disobedience. And honestly, that may be even more dangerous. Because authoritarian systems are strongest when people stop imagining alternatives. The second someone chooses differently, truly differently, the illusion of total control begins breaking apart. And Agnes may become the first major crack in the future Gilead worked so hard to build. Why Agnes matters more than people think. At first glance, Agnes does not seem like the type of person who could threaten an entire regime. That is what makes her important. She is not a revolutionary in the traditional sense. She is not powerful, not violent, not politically connected. She is exactly the kind of person Gilead expects to control forever. A young woman raised entirely inside the system, educated by its rules, surrounded by its ideology, conditioned to obey. And that is why her choices matter so much more than open rebellion. Because if somebody raised inside Gilead itself begins rejecting its future, then the regime faces a terrifying problem. Its indoctrination is failing. That possibility is catastrophic for authoritarian governments. Because systems like Gilead survive through generational control. The leaders do not just want obedience from adults. They want children born into the system to emotionally accept it as normal. That is how authoritarian power becomes permanent. But Agnes represents the possibility that even people shaped by Gilead can still see through it. And once that starts happening, collapse becomes inevitable. Gilead's greatest fear is independent thought. One of the most important truths about Gilead is that it does not actually fear violence as much as it fears independent thinking. Violence can be punished. Rebellions can be crushed. But ideas are much harder to control, especially once people begin questioning the system internally. That is why education, books, information, and memory are treated as dangerous throughout the Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments. Because once people start imagining different futures, fear loses some of its power. And Agnes, slowly becoming capable of making her own moral decisions, threatens the emotional foundation of Gilead itself. Because Gilead depends on people believing they have no real alternative. The moment Agnes starts realizing she does have a choice, the entire illusion weakens. And honestly, that is what makes her storyline so powerful. She is not simply choosing between two paths. She is choosing whether Gilead deserves to define her identity forever. Why Agnes choosing herself changes everything. Gilead teaches women that obedience is a virtue, sacrifice is purity, submission is safety. But Agnes beginning to think for herself completely disrupts that system psychologically. Because once one person chooses autonomy, others begin imagining it too. That is how authoritarian systems slowly unravel. Not all at once, emotionally, quietly. One person realizes the system is not inevitable. Then another person notices, then another. And eventually, fear no longer controls people the same way. Agnes represents something incredibly dangerous in that kind of world. Possibility. Because if somebody raised entirely within Gilead can still choose differently, then the regime's power is not absolute, and Gilead cannot survive people realizing that truth. Aunt Lydia may already understand Agnes' importance. One of the most fascinating parts of the Testaments is how certain characters seem to understand that younger women like Agnes represent the future of Gilead itself. Especially Aunt Lydia. Because Lydia understands something the commanders often ignore. Fear alone cannot sustain a civilization forever. Eventually, younger generations start asking questions. Eventually, contradictions become impossible to ignore. And Lydia sees those contradictions everywhere. She sees the corruption of the commanders, the hypocrisy hiding underneath religious language, the emotional damage caused by the system. Which means Lydia may already recognize how important Agnes' choices truly are. Not because Agnes is politically powerful, but because symbolic choices become dangerous inside authoritarian systems. If Agnes chooses herself instead of the future Gilead planned for her, then she becomes proof that the regime's control is incomplete. And incomplete control terrifies dictatorships. Why Gilead's younger generation is its biggest weakness. This is where the theory becomes even more important. Because Agnes may not be the only young woman beginning to question Gilead internally. And that creates a massive long-term problem for the regime. Authoritarian systems often survive through the first generation using fear and shock. But controlling future generations becomes harder, especially once people born inside the system begin noticing hypocrisy. And Gilead is built on hypocrisy. The commanders preach morality while secretly breaking their own laws. Women are told suffering creates virtue, while powerful men exploit the system constantly. Over time, younger generations begin recognizing those contradictions. That is dangerous. Because once people emotionally disconnect from the ideology itself, obedience becomes performative instead of genuine. People stop believing, they simply pretend. And when enough people start pretending instead of believing, collapse begins quietly underneath the surface. Agnes may represent the beginning of that emotional shift. Agnes choosing freedom could inspire others. One of the most terrifying things for Gilead is not armed rebellion, it is inspiration. Because inspiration spreads faster than fear once people realize change is possible. Imagine younger women inside Gilead hearing about Agnes making a different choice. Imagine them realizing somebody raised exactly like them still found the courage to reject the future assigned to her. That changes people psychologically. Suddenly, obedience no longer feels inevitable, and once enough people stop emotionally accepting the system, authoritarian power weakens dramatically. Because dictatorships rely heavily on hopelessness, people obey partly because they believe resistance cannot succeed. But Agnes choosing freedom could quietly destroy that hopelessness. Not immediately, not publicly, but emotionally. And emotional change is often where political collapse truly begins. The most dangerous thing Agnes can become. Ironically, the most dangerous thing Agnes could become is not a rebel. It is a symbol. Because symbols outlive punishment. Gilead can imprison rebels, execute dissidents, silence critics, but symbols are much harder to erase once people emotionally connect to them. And Agnes has the potential to become symbolic proof that Gilead's control is not permanent. That possibility alone could destabilize the system long-term, especially among younger women already questioning their future internally. Because once people realize obedience is a choice rather than destiny, fear loses some of its power forever. The beginning of collapse may already exist. What makes this theory so terrifying is how realistic it feels. Most authoritarian systems do not collapse because of one giant battle. They collapse because enough people slowly stop believing. And honestly, that process may already be happening inside Gilead. The commanders no longer fully believe in their own morality. The younger generation increasingly notices contradictions. The women understand the emotional cost of the system more clearly than anyone else. And characters like Agnes represent something Gilead cannot fully control anymore. Independent identity. That may ultimately become the regime's greatest weakness. Because once people start defining themselves outside authoritarian systems, those systems slowly lose the power to emotionally own them. At first glance, Agnes seems small compared to the massive political structure of Gilead. But that is exactly why her choices matter so much. Because authoritarian systems survive by convincing ordinary people their lives belong to the regime, their future, their identity, their purpose. And Agnes choosing differently threatens that illusion completely. Not through violence, not through revolution, but through personal freedom. Because the moment somebody raised entirely inside Gilead still chooses autonomy, the regime faces a terrifying truth. Its control is not absolute anymore. And honestly, that may be how Gilead truly begins collapsing. Not from the outside, but from the quiet realization spreading inside people that they still have the power to choose for themselves.